Let's dive straight in. We're unpacking a fascinating period in early Indian societies, roughly spanning, 1,000 years?
Yeah.
From about 600 BCE to 600 CE.
That's right. A really formative time.
Yeah, and you see new towns emerging, agriculture expanding, just all sorts of social structures being reshaped. Our focus today, how people organize themselves. We're talking family connections, those layered social hierarchies we often call caste,
Right.
and how wealth and status played into all of it. It's a deep dive into the very fabric of ancient society, looking at the rules, sure, but maybe more interestingly, how people actually lived.
Mm-hmm. The gap between the ideal and the real.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this entire exploration is built on the sources you provided, these excerpts from academic work, leading heavily on the Mahabharata, but also other literature, inscriptions.
Stone inscriptions, yeah, and even archaeological digs.
Right.
And, a key part of this is understanding that these sources aren't just straightforward history books. Texts, poems, inscriptions, they all come with perspectives.
Oh.
They were written by specific people for particular audiences with certain goals, So figuring out who composed something, for whom, the language they chose, Sanskrit, or maybe Pali, Prakrit, Tamil.
That matters.
It really does, and how widely those ideas spread.
Mm-hmm.
It's all part of the picture. It helps us see the debates, the complexities.
It's not monolithic.
Not at all. And the Mahabharata is absolutely central here. It's more than just an incredible story. It's this colossal epic. It evolved over roughly 1,000 years.
1,000 years.
Yeah, reaching over 100,000 verses. So it's packed with social situations, norms, and sometimes, surprising deviations from those norms. It gives us a glimpse into the ideas floating around.
So our mission basically is to dig into these sources, pull out those key insights about kinship, social difference, resources, and see what light they shed on this dynamic period. We want to get beyond just describing ancient rules and really try to understand the vibrant, sometimes, messy reality.
The messy reality is often the most interesting part.
Totally. So as we begin to explore these sources together, what already sparks your curiosity? What jumps out at you about how these ancient societies were put together?
Well, the first thing is maybe how they even tried to make sense of it all themselves.
Okay, let's start with something that feels universal. Family and marriage. We think of family ties as natural, maybe blood relations, right?
Right.
But these sources show how diverse family structures and ideas about kinship could actually be. You get terms like kula for the immediate family,
The household unit.
jati for a wider network of kinfolk, and vamsha for lineage, the line of descent.
Yeah, and how those ties were defined, who counted as kin, even things like whether cousins were seen as close relatives that could vary quite a bit.
It's tricky for historians, isn't it? Because elite families, ruling dynasties, they left more records.
Oh, definitely. Inscriptions, texts mentioning their lineage, much easier to trace. Reconstructing the family lives of, ordinary people is way harder.
But the sources do give us a lot about the attitudes, the ideals around family and kinship.
Exactly. And those ideals often reveal tensions with what was actually happening.
Like patrilineal. That seems like a big one, especially in the major Sanskrit text.
Yeah.
Tracing descent through the father, sons inheriting resources, status. I mean, the core conflict of the Mahabharata itself, that feud between the Kauravas and Pandavas over the Kuru kingdom, it's basically a story about reinforcing patrilineal succession in the end.
It really is. The expectation was absolutely that sons would succeed fathers. Ruling dynasties from around 600 BCE onwards, they largely claimed to follow this.
Claim to.
Right. But the historical record shows exceptions. What if there were no sons?
Yeah, what then?
Well, brothers sometimes succeeded, or other kinsmen, and we even have sources mentioning women, like Pravati Gupta, who actually wielded power. It wasn't always straightforward.
And this emphasis goes way back.
Oh, yeah. Ritual texts like the Rig Veda, much older, already show this concern. There's a marriage blessing specifically praying for fine sons. That tells you something.
That Mahabharata excerpt you provided about the Kaurava-Pandava conflict, it really shows the stakes involved in patrilineal.
It does.
Dhritarashtra is blind, his brother Pandu reigns, then dies, leaving Dhritarashtra as regent. The text says the citizens preferred the virtuous Pandavas. And Duryodhana, the eldest Kaurava, is just seething with jealousy, terrified he'll lose out on the inheritance, the throne.
And that story, whether it's literal history or not, it's powerful because it lays bare these competing ideas. Is kingship about birthright? Or is it about virtue, capability?
Right, the tension.
Exactly. The narrative tension highlights just how intensely important birth into the right family was, even if other qualities were also valued.
So sons were crucial for the lineage, for the inheritance. What about daughters? They seem to fit differently into this patrilineal picture.
Very differently. Generally, they had no claim on the household resources of their birth family. And marrying outside one's kin group, exogamy, was often seen as desirable, especially for high-status families, which meant intense control over daughters' lives, basically, ensuring they married the right person at the right time. Giving a daughter in marriage, kanyadana, became this really significant religious duty for the father.
And did things change as society shifted, like with the growth of towns?
That probably complicated things, yeah. From around 600 BCE, you get these new urban centers, people coming together from different backgrounds, maybe with different marriage practices. They're meeting, sharing ideas.
So potential challenges to the old ways.
Potentially. And Brahmanical authors seem to respond by compiling these really detailed social codes, texts like the Dharma Sutras, later the Manusmriti, written between roughly 500 BCE and 200 CE.
Trying to lay down the law, basically.
Kind of. They aimed for universal validity, but the reality of regional diversity, different local customs, it meant these rules weren't necessarily accepted or followed everywhere. Brahmanical influence had its limits.
These Dharma Sutras even described 8 different forms of marriage.
8 forms, yeah. Some seen as prestigious, like, gifting a daughter to a learned man.
The ideal.
Right. But others reflected practices maybe outside that Brahmanical norm, like a groom basically buying the bride. Or even just a union based on mutual desire. Only the first 4 were considered good.
It makes you think, who actually had the agency? Who was choosing the partner in these different scenarios?
That's a great question. And another distinctive Brahmanical practice that developed around this time, maybe starting even earlier, around 1000 BCE, was the Gotra system.
Gotra, classifying people based on names of Vedic seers.
Exactly. And the core rules were: a woman adopts her husband's Gotra upon marriage, and crucially, no marriage within the same Gotra, reinforcing that exogamy ideal again.
Okay, so that's the rule.
Yeah.
But here's where the sources throw a curveball, right, with the Satavahana rulers.
Ah, yes, the Satavahanas. Ruling in western India, the Deccan, roughly 2nd century BCE to 2nd century CE, their inscriptions often use metronymics.
Names from the mother, like Gautami Puta, Vasiti Puta.
Right, and Gautami, Vasiti, those are feminine forms of Gotra names.
So, what's the twist?
The twist, the really fascinating insight from their inscriptions, is that Satavahana women who married into the ruling family often kept their father's Gotra names. They didn't adopt their husbands.
Directly contradicting the Brahmanical rule.
Directly, and wait, there's more. Some of these women actually belonged to the same Gotra as their husbands.
So they were practicing endogamy, marrying within the kin group.
Precisely, which was common in parts of South India, but totally against the Brahmanical exogamy rule. So this specific inscription evidence shows that even powerful elites didn't necessarily follow the ideal norms laid down in those Sanskrit texts.
Wow. It really makes you wonder about the dynamics within those families. Does the use of metronymics hint that mothers had significant status, maybe influence, even if succession was patrilineal?
It's suggestive, isn't it? We can't say for sure, but it raises questions, and you even see a mother's voice, albeit ignored, in the Mahabharata itself, Gandhari trying to counsel Duryodhana away from war, urging peace and dharma.
Yeah, that scene.
That scene, even though it's fictional, it suggests the idea of a mother offering vital counsel was, present. It adds another layer to understanding family beyond just the formal rules.
Okay, so moving beyond the immediate family, let's tackle the broader social differences.
Yeah.
Particularly this concept of varna, what we often translate as caste.
A very influential framework.
The Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras present this ideal hierarchical order. Brahmanas claiming the top spot, asserting divine origin for the whole system.
Right.
With groups like Shudras and those deemed untouchable at the bottom. And status, according to these texts, was all determined by birth.
Yeah, and these texts also laid out the ideal occupations for the 4 main varnas. Brahmanas did the religious stuff, studying Vedas, sacrifices. Kshatriyas were warriors, rulers, protectors. Vaishyas were involved in farming, herding, trade. And Shudras were assigned the role of serving the other 3.
How did they try to make this stick?
Well, several strategies. One was claiming divine origin, referencing that Purusha Sukta hymn from the Rig Veda, the one where the Varnas come from different body parts of a cosmic being.
The mouth, arms, thighs, feet.
Exactly. They also advised kings to enforce the system within their kingdoms, and they tried hard to persuade people that status was just fixed by birth, reinforcing it with stories and texts like the Mahabharata.
But you have to wonder, why quote that Purusha Sukta so often? Was it universally accepted?
Good question. Quoting it repeatedly might suggest they needed to keep reinforcing it, perhaps because it wasn't universally accepted without question.
And the sources show reality was, again, more complex. Kings weren't always Kshatriyas, were they?
No, not at all. We have sources suggesting important ruling lines had different origins. The Mauryas, there's debate, but possibly lower origins. The Shingas and Kanvis who followed them were Brahmanas.
So power wasn't just about birth rank.
It seems political power often came down to mustering resources, building support networks, practical things, not just adhering strictly to the Varna hierarchy.
What about groups considered outsiders? Like the Shakas, the Mlechechas?
That's another fascinating area. The Brahmanical texts often viewed them as barbarians outside the system, but then you see a Shanka ruler like Rudradaman in the 2nd century CE using Sanskrit for a major public inscription about rebuilding a lake.
So clearly familiar with Sanskritic culture.
Very familiar. And even more striking is that Satavahana ruler, Gautamiputra Sirisatakani, he claims to be this unique, ideal Brahmana and a destroyer of Kshatriya pride.
Okay.
While also claiming he stopped intervarna marriage. But then he arranges a marriage alliance with the family of Rajanaman, a Mlecha.
Wow. Okay, so the rules were flexible.
It shows this really complex process of integration, negotiation, and sometimes just outright deviation from the supposed norms, even among the elite who claim to uphold them.
And that story of Drona and Ekalavya from the Mahabharata, that seems like a powerful, maybe tragic example of how rigid the system could be.
It really is. Drona, the Brahmana archery teacher, refuses Ekalavya because he's a Nishada from a forest-dwelling hunting community.
But Ekalavya teaches himself, using a clay image of Drona, becomes incredibly skilled.
Astonishingly skilled. And when Drona finds out, he demands Ekalavya's right thumb as his teacher's fee, his guru Dakshina.
Why? To keep his promise to Arjuna.
To ensure Arjuna remains the unrivaled archer, yes. And Ekalavya complies, losing his exceptional skill.
What message does that send?
Well, it's pretty stark, isn't it? It seems to convey a message about who is allowed access to certain kinds of knowledge or skills based purely on birth. Was Drona acting according to the Dharma Sutras? Maybe. But it certainly highlights the potential for harsh exclusion and the devastating consequences of challenging these birth-based restrictions.
Beyond the 4 Varnas, there's another term, Jati. How does that fit in?
Jati is also about social categories based on birth, but unlike Varna, there wasn't a fixed number. It seems to have been a more flexible term used to classify groups that didn't neatly fit the 4 Varnas, like the Nishadas, or occupational groups like goldsmiths, Suvarnakara. Sometimes Jatis that shared an occupation formed guilds, or shrinis.
Guilds, right, like craftspeople organizing.
Exactly. And we have this wonderful inscription from Mandsaur, maybe 5th century CE, about a guild of silk weavers. They originally migrated from Gujarat. They shared this craft identity.
Right.
But the inscription also mentions some members took up other professions, and crucially, as a collective group, they invested their considerable wealth in building a sun temple.
So what does that tell us?
It shows mobility they moved, some changed jobs. It shows a strong collective identity beyond just their original craft. And it shows they could act together and accumulate significant wealth. It's a glimpse of a complex social reality far from just rigid occupational boxes. Were these weavers strictly following Shastra prescriptions? Probably not all of them.
And merchants, Vanic, mostly Vaishyas.
That was the theoretical association, but texts again suggest a more complex picture. You find references to Brahmanas and Kshatriyas involved in trade too. The lines blur.
What about groups entirely outside this? Forest dwellers, nomads?
Yeah, groups beyond the 4 Varnas, often described negatively in Sanskrit texts, sometimes as uncivilized or even demonic, like Rakshasas.
But interactions still happen.
Clearly, ideas were shared. And you get stories in the Mahabharata like Bhima marrying Hidimba, a so-called Rakshasa sister. Maybe these narratives are grappling with how to represent interaction, even intermarriage, with communities whose lifestyles and practices were very different from the Brahmanical norms being codified.
This brings us to maybe the sharpest social divide described in the texts. The categories deemed untouchable.
A really stark form of hierarchy based on ideas of purity and pollution.
How did that work?
The idea was that certain activities, especially those related to rituals and religious performance, were sacred and pure. Other tasks, particularly handling corpses, dealing with dead animals, were considered inherently polluting.
And certain groups were assigned these tasks.
Exactly. Chandalas were placed at the very bottom of the hierarchy, tasked with these polluting jobs, disposing of the bodies of those without relatives, acting as executioners. Their very touch, even their sight, was considered polluting by those adhering to these norms.
And the Manusmriti laid out rules for them.
Very harsh rules. They had to live outside the village, use discarded pots and clothes, wear iron ornaments, couldn't walk around in villages or cities at night.
We even have accounts from travelers.
Yes. Chinese Buddhist pilgrims like Faxin around the 5th century CE and Xuanzang in the 7th century, they observed people they identified as untouchables having to sound clappers to warn others of their approach, or living segregated outside city walls. It suggests this kind of social exclusion was definitely being practiced in some places.
But the crucial question is, did these groups just passively accept this degraded status?
That's exactly the question. And non-Brahmanical sources, especially Buddhist ones, offer hints of alternative perspectives, maybe even resistance.
Like the Matunga Jataka.
Precisely. It's a story from a Pali Buddhist text where the Bodhisattva, the Buddha, in a previous life is born as a Chandala named Matunga.
Okay.
And he faces this intense discrimination. A merchant's daughter sees him, considers herself polluted, has her eyes washed, her companions beat Matunga up. But Matunga, through his virtue, gains spiritual power. He eventually marries that same merchant's daughter, and they have a son, Mandavya, who becomes learned in the Vedas, essentially passing as a Brahmana.
And then?
Then one day, Matunga, dressed in rags, comes to his son's house seeking alms, while Mandavya is feeding Brahmanas. The son refuses him, saying the food is only for Brahmanas, calling his own father an outcast.
Ouch.
But Matunga's reply is the key. He says, basically, those who are proud of their birth and are ignorant don't deserve gifts. On the contrary, those who are free from vices are worthy of offerings.
Wow, that's a direct challenge.
Absolutely. This story, likely reflecting the perspective of marginalized groups or those within Buddhist circles, completely rejects the idea that birth determines worthiness or spiritual potential. It flips the script and says inner virtue is what truly matters. What does hearing that in a Buddhist text suggest to you about the possibility of challenging those dominant Brahmanical views?
It suggests there were definitely alternative ways of thinking about status. Okay, let's shift slightly and talk about how resources and status intersected. It wasn't just about birth, right? Access to economic resources mattered.
Hugely. Access to land, cattle, money, control over other people's labor slaves. Landless laborers, this clearly shaped social positions, from the poorest laborer to the king.
The Mahabharata's dice game episode seems relevant here. Yudhisthira gambling away his kingdom, his brothers, himself, even Draupadi.
It's a dramatic illustration of concepts of ownership, what could be possessed, what could be staked.
Yeah.
And texts like the Manusmriti lay out rules about property. Paternal estate generally went to the sons.
Usually the eldest getting a special share.
Often, yes. And women typically had no claim to that core family estate, the land, and so on.
But they could own some things.
Yes, they were allowed Stridhana, literally, woman's wealth. This was usually gifts received at marriage from her family or the groom's side. This wealth was supposed to be inherited by her children, and her husband wasn't supposed to have a claim on it.
But there's always a but.
There's often a but in the Manusmriti. It also warns women against hoarding property or family valuables without their husband's permission. So, while the ideal of Stridhana existed, control might have been contested.
And we do see examples of wealthy women, like Queen Prabhavati Gupta you mentioned.
Exactly. So women could control significant resources in some cases. But the overall picture from these texts and inscriptions suggests that men generally controlled the most crucial forms of wealth: land, cattle, money. And this definitely sharpened social differences between men and women based purely on access to resources.
Manusmriti even lists different ways men and women could acquire wealth, right?
It does. 7 ways for men: inheritance, finding, purchase, conquest, investment, work, gifts from good people. 6 ways for women: gifts given at marriage, during the bridal procession, tokens of affection, gifts from her brother, mother, or father, subsequent gifts after marriage, and gifts from her husband. It reflects different expected spheres of activity and access.
And how did Varna link to property access in theory?
Well, the Brahmanical texts implied that Brahmanas and Kshatriyas would naturally be the wealthiest, based on their prescribed roles receiving gifts, ruling, warfare. Shudras were explicitly assigned only servitude.
Did reality match that neat picture?
Often, depictions in texts support it. You see wealthy kings and priests. But we know there were poor Brahmanas, and as we discussed, archaeological evidence and inscriptions show wealthy merchants, craftspeople, even potentially wealthy Shudras. So access to wealth didn't always map perfectly onto the Varna ideal.
Which brings us back to critiques of the whole Varna system, especially from early Buddhism.
Yes, the Buddhists recognized social differences existed, obviously, but they fundamentally rejected the idea that these differences were natural, divinely ordained, or inflexibly determined by birth.
There's that dialogue you included from the Majjhima Nikaya.
Ah, yes, between King Avantaputta and Kachana, a disciple of the Buddha. It's quite revealing.
The king basically repeats the standard Brahmanical line, Brahmanas are superior, born from Brahma's mouth, etc.
And Kachana doesn't argue directly. He just asks a hypothetical question. If a Shudra were wealthy, really rich, could he employ servants from all Varnas, even Brahmanas and Kshatriyas who would obey him?
And the king has to admit.
He has to admit, yes, wealth brings that kind of power. A rich Shudra could command obedience from anyone.
So Kachana's follow-up is,
this being so, sire, are not these four Varnas exactly the same? And the king concedes, on this count, Kachana, there is no difference among these four Varnas.
That's the aha moment.
Exactly. This Buddhist text is proposing a completely different explanation for social difference. It's not about divine birth. It's about access to resources, wealth, power, a radical idea for the time.
And there were other alternative social scenarios, too, like in ancient Tamilakam.
Yes, down south in the Tamil region, roughly 2,000 years ago, sources like the Sangam poems paint a slightly different picture. Wealth differences certainly existed there, too. But the chiefs, who were often patrons of poets and bards,
they were valued differently.
They were valued not just for having resources, but for sharing them. Generosity was key.
You included that excerpt from the Puranuru.
Right, describing a chief who shares whatever he has, even if he's not always wealthy himself. He's called an enemy to the hunger of bards. The poem even says he gets a spear made for war specifically to acquire more wealth to give away.
So generosity versus miserliness becomes a major way to judge status, not just birth or accumulation.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a different emphasis, a different set of values for achieving respect and social standing.
So we've seen different social structures, different ways status was achieved. What about how people explain these differences? Or why did inequality exist at all?
Good question. And again, we see contrasting explanations. The dominant Brahmanical view, as we said, claimed the Varna order was divinely created, fixed, ordained from the beginning via the Purusha Sukta myth.
Natural hierarchy.
Right. But the Buddhists offered a very different theory, which you find in the Sutta Pitaka. It's a kind of origin myth.
How does that one go?
It describes an initial idyllic state of existence. Beings lived in harmony, took only what they needed from nature. But gradually, things deteriorated. Greed, deceit, theft, violence emerged, leading to conflict.
Sounds familiar,
doesn't it? And in response to this chaos, the myth says, people got together and collectively agreed to choose one person among them, the Mahasamada, meaning the great elect.
Elected.
Chosen, yeah. Their job was to regulate things, be wrathful when needed, censure wrongdoers, banish those who deserved it. And in return for this service, the people agreed to give him a proportion of their rice, essentially taxes.
So kingship based on human choice, social contract.
That's exactly what it suggests. Kingship arises from human need and agreement, not divine appointment, and taxes are payment for the service of maintaining order. The huge implication here is human agency. Humans created this system.
Which contrasts sharply with the Brahmanical view of a divinely ordained, unchanging order.
Absolutely. The Buddhist view implies that if humans created the system, theoretically, humans could also change it. A very different perspective on the origins and potential future of social relations.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the content of these sources, especially the Mahabharata. But how do historians actually handle such a complex text? It's not just one book written at one time.
No, definitely not. It's a huge challenge. Historians use critical methods. First, they look at the language. Is it archaic Vedic Sanskrit, the simpler epic Sanskrit, or maybe a text in Pali, Prakrit, Tamil? The language tells you a lot.
Right. than the type of text.
Yeah, is it a mantra, a ritual prescription? Is it a narrative story? A didactic section laying down social norms? Who are the likely authors? Who was their intended audience? And trying to date the different layers of the text is crucial. It's only after doing all that groundwork that they can really start using the content to understand the historical context.
That critical edition project you mentioned earlier sounds key for that, comparing all those manuscripts.
It was absolutely vital because it revealed not just the Common Core, but also those enormous regional variations. Seeing where and when different parts were added or changed helps trace the social history within the text itself.
And the language of the Mahabharata's Sanskrit version. You said it's simpler than older texts.
Yes, simpler than the Vedas or formal royal inscriptions, Prashastis. This suggests it was probably meant for and likely understood by a much wider audience than just priestly elites.
The text itself is called Itihasa. Thus it was, often translated as history. But was it? Was the Great War real?
That's a huge debate among historians. Some believe the epic preserves a memory of an actual, perhaps smaller-scale conflict among kin groups in the Kuru region. Others find little corroborating evidence for a war of that magnitude and see it more as foundational myth. Archaeology helps a bit. B.B. Lal's excavations at Hastinapura, the Kuru capital in the epic.
What did he find?
He found settlement layers. An earlier one, maybe 12th, 7th century BCE, had simple mud and reed walls. A later layer, roughly 6th, 3rd century BCE, showed more substantial structures, mud bricks, even some burnt bricks, drains.
So, evidence of a city. But does it match the epic's description? That glorious city bursting like the ocean?
That's the million-dollar question. Do the archaeological finds match that grand poetic description? Or was that description added later when large urban centers did flourish after the 6th century BCE? Or is it just poetic license, not meant to be historically precise? It highlights the challenge of matching epic literature with archaeological remains.
Another really challenging episode you highlighted is Draupadi's marriage. Polyandry, married to all 5 Panda brothers. It's central to the plot.
Absolutely central. But it clearly caused some discomfort even for the composers or redactors of the epic.
How could we tell?
Because the text itself offers multiple, sometimes contradictory explanations for why this happened. Was it because Kunti accidentally told them to share what they brought home? Was Draupadi a reincarnation of Indra's wife? Did she pray to Shiva 5 times for a husband in a past life?
So many reasons.
Exactly. Why offer so many different justifications? Historians often interpret this multiplicity as a sign that the practice itself, while maybe prevalent among certain groups or elites at some earlier point,
or maybe in specific regions like the Himalayas where it's known,
possibly, or maybe even a crisis measure during times of warfare leading to a shortage of women. But whatever the origin, by the time Brahmanas were significantly shaping the text, this polyandrous marriage was clearly seen as unusual, something that needed explanation and justification to fit within the evolving norms they were promoting.
It shows the text isn't just reflecting society, it's actively interpreting and sometimes struggling with it.
Precisely. Creative literature has its own narrative logic, its own demands. It doesn't always give us a simple, literal snapshot of social reality, even while it sheds invaluable light on the ideas, tensions, and debates within that society.
But what's truly remarkable about the Mahabharata, as you said, is that it wasn't static. It didn't just stop with the Sanskrit version.
Not at all. It's a dynamic tradition, a living text. Versions were written down, retold orally, in many different languages across India over centuries.
Absorbing local stories.
Yes, incorporating regional variations, stories from specific communities. The core narrative itself was retold in countless ways, adapted for different audiences. And it inspired sculpture, painting, dance, theater. It permeated the culture.
These retellings weren't just repeats.
No, they often engaged creatively, even critically, with the original. Mahashweta Devi's short story, Kuntio Nishadi, written in Bengali in the late 20th century, is a powerful modern example of this.
Remind us of the original episode it relates to, Duryodhana's plot with the House of Lac.
That's the one. The Pandavas are meant to burn in a house made of lac. They get tipped off and escape through a tunnel. But tragically, a Nishada woman and her 5 sons, who had come seeking food and got drunk, were asleep inside.
And they died in the fire. Their bodies were mistaken for the Pandavas.
Exactly. Now, Mahashweta Devi's story is set years later after the Great War. Kunti is reflecting on her life, her sins, and she's confronted by a Nishadi woman whose mother-in-law was that very woman who died in the fire.
Wow.
And the Nishadi points out Kunti's profound ethical blind spot. In all her reflections on saving her own sons, she never once acknowledged or mourned the 6 innocent Nishada lives that were sacrificed for their escape.
That's powerful.
It really is. The retelling completely shifts the perspective, forces the reader to confront the voices marginalized or silenced in the original epic, the fate of the Nishadas, Kunti's responsibility. It shows how the epic continues to be this incredibly rich source for grappling with social justice, inequality, and ethical questions even today.
What a journey. We've gone through kinship rules, marriage variations, the complexities of Varna and Jati, the harshness of untouchability, how wealth and status intertwined, different explanations for inequality, all by digging into these incredible sources, especially the Mahabharata. It's amazing how much these ancient texts, inscriptions, even digs, can reveal about the ideas and realities shaping those societies.
It really is, and I think the key takeaways often lie in those tensions, the contradictions we kept finding. That gap between the ideal norms, especially the Brahmanical ones laid out in texts, and the diverse, often messy social practices on the ground.
Like the Siddhavahana marriages.
Exactly. Or non-Kshatriya kings holding power, evidence of wealthy Shudras, the Mandasur weavers showing mobility and collective action, the powerful challenge to birth status in the Matanga Jataka.
And the different ways people tried to explain social difference itself.
Right. Was it divine origin, fixed forever? Or was it a result of human agency, maybe a social contract?
Yeah.
Or primarily driven by access to wealth and resources? Different traditions offered fundamentally different answers.
And realizing that the Mahabharata isn't just a window onto history, but it's a historical object itself.
Yes. Constantly evolving, being reshaped over centuries, reflecting the changing ideas and concerns of the people who told, wrote, and listened to it.
You know, these ancient sources, these stories, they're not just about back then. They grapple with really fundamental questions about family, status, wealth, fairness, who belongs, who doesn't. Things that still resonate so deeply in our own world.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought for you to ponder. Considering how dynamic the Mahabharata has been, absorbing regional stories, being retold from so many perspectives over hundreds, even thousands of years, what might that tell us about how societies themselves evolve and how they continually reinterpret their own foundational stories and values?
That is definitely something to think about. If any of these specific stories or ideas caught your attention today, we really hope you'll dig deeper. That's what this deep dive is all about.